Okay, welcome to Module 1, Part A. In Part A, what I'd like to talk about is the whole idea of what we mean by CRM, Customer Relationship Management. And one of the things that we use in the discipline of marketing is we tend to call it relationship marketing, how we manage our customers. And again, it's a matter of managing both the buyer and the seller simultaneously. A recent Forbes magazine article suggested that the idea of customer retention is an enduring paradigm in terms of supply chain management. And in fact, it goes back to a study done at the start of this millennium by Fortune that said 20% of your customers, the average company loses about 20% of its customers each year. So let me say that again. The average company loses about 1 out of 5 customers each year. Now, if you think about that progressively and the cost of getting new customers, it goes back to the old adage, it's more expensive to go out and get new customers than it is to retain existing customers. Now, that Fortune study is a little bit dated because you've seen these paradigmatic shifts in this whole relational approach to customer service. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about when we talk about this relational approach is the term relational. And relational was actually born out of contract law theory by a guy named Ian McNeill. And that's not particularly important. But what he apparently looked at was that contracts or any kind of agreements are not just something that's very explicit where all the terms are spelled out, but there's also an implicit part of an agreement. And if we go back to the marriage metaphor that we talked about earlier, there are a lot of implicit agreements or understandings that occur, and the same thing's true in the global marketplace. Now, by relational, what we mean are those governance norms, and we'll talk more about governance norms, but those norms are rules of behavior that keep the marriage or relationship together. And there are 3 components of relationalism that you should be aware of. One, when we talk about relationalism, we're talking about a temporal, long-term orientation as opposed to short-term orientation. So the first point is it's long-term versus short-term. The second point of relational is there's a set of understandings or norms that govern relationships. In other words, when we talk about social contracts, as we alluded to earlier, there's kind of rules of the game. And those rules of the game are important because if the rules to the game change, so does the customer relationship. And finally, that the outcomes of any relationship must be win-win. And I think this is one of the most fundamental myths in all of relational types of management paradigms. When we talk about customer relationship management, does it mean it's really 50-50? Probably not. It means that we're satisfied when we talk about a win-win. It may be 30-70 or 60-40, but it meets the expectations of all the marketing channel role sets that are involved in a relationship. So do relationships really matter? Well, the other side of relationalism is what we call transaction cost economics. We'll talk more about transaction approach later. But by transaction, think about a continuum that goes from relational, ongoing win-win relationships all the way to the other extreme of very transactional, discrete, non-continuous relationships where opportunism or getting the upper hand guides what's best for the agreement. Okay? Certainly not characteristic of a relationship. Now, when we talk about whether or not relationships matter, consider IBM's forecast more than 10 years ago. It suggested that a 1% improvement in customers, and when I say customers, that means retaining customers and customer services worldwide on one brand of its one product line would increase business by more than 200 million in 5 years. So the payback for retaining customers really goes immediately to the bottom line. And it makes it sound like it's only a revenue stream, but it's also a savings and cost stream that's concurrent with that type of relational approach. The second reason that relationships matter is that if you look at many companies like Ford Motor Company, American Express, Richards, which is a local advertising company in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, they estimate that it's far more costly to get new customers than to keep the ones you have now. Ford Motor Company at one time used the algorithm of it's 5 times costlier to get a new customer, to attract new customers, than it is to keep one. American Express suggests that its empirical research says it's 20 times more costly for that type of service to attract new customers than to retain existing customers. So there's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests a normal company's growth rate could be more than doubled by cutting in half the number of lost customers each year. By reducing your attrition in half, okay, you can actually double growth rates. And that's a big, big matter of importance to stakeholders, especially stockholders in public companies. So we're really talking about a transformation when we talk about supply chain management thought and how it acts in the global marketplace. Traditionally, in any global marketplace, we thought about sellers going to buyers, okay? So the seller is kind of approaching the buyer, and then the outcome is the exchange. But what we're suggesting is that buyers and sellers come together and the exchange is at the middle. It's especially important in the global marketplace where you may be doing sourcing in China, Malaysia, Argentina, the sub-Saharan region. When you're doing that, think about the massive challenges that underlie trying to balance these relationships. And it may be a Western company in Europe or the US or Canada, and on the other end, your trading partner may be some other company or a trading company like Li and Fung in Hong Kong that you read about. So in a global marketplace, this relational idea takes on many, many different modes. And I want to talk a little bit about the theory. And one of the things I always say in Latin, que vadamus, where are we going with this? You know, what is the whole point? We hear relational exchange and building relationships used for everything and anything. But truly what relationship marketing is about is something that was born out of institutional economics. Institutional economics takes a very rational approach, and it's really non-descriptive in the global marketplace. Because if you just apply supply and demand curves and optimum pricing, they're important concepts, don't get me wrong, but they really don't explain what happens in managing value chains in the global marketplace. So at one point, we had neo-institutional economics, and we start looking at the roles of opportunism and the trade-offs and reciprocity that govern relationships. But even then, you were constrained by trying to isolate cost. As I said, we'll talk more about transaction cost economics later. And then we were born out of this relational exchange. Now, relational exchange isn't some kind of ubiquitous model that you can just a cookie cutter or a template that you can put over all supply chain relationships. In fact, there are a lot of different imperatives and different ways of looking at relational exchange. But there are 3 norms that we say are fairly ecumenical in all relationships. And I want to talk about those 3 norms. The first one is solidarity. And what we mean by solidarity is it's the glue that keeps the relationship together. So if we're talking about a supplier and manufacturer, what's the glue that keeps it together? Is it all based on cost and value, or is it based on personal relationships? As we said, people have relationships, companies have agreements. So the solidarity is the glue that holds the relationship together. And again, you might think back to the marriage metaphor we talked about earlier. The second governance norm is what we call mutuality, and it alludes to that win-win, that the outcomes of the relationship have to give some kind of positive meet or exceed expectations of the buyer or seller. That's fairly straightforward. But finally, it's that item that I alluded to earlier in the arrows that keep together suppliers, manufacturers, and all role set members. It's role integrity. And role integrity is predicated on trust and commitment. Remember, we asked the question whether you can have a marriage with trust, high levels of trust, but low commitment, or vice versa. And we said, yes, you can. But ideally, you know, kind of the holy grail is to get trust and commitment at such a high level that, in fact, these are not mutually exclusive, that indeed fortifies the relational bond or the solidarity in the relationship. Every time we talk about relationships, we're talking about a long-term orientation as opposed to short-term. Now, what constitutes long-term? In the US, it's quite different than if you go to Europe. And that's quite different than if you go to Asia or if you go to the Middle East, where long terms are very long terms in comparison to the quarterly reporting that we do for public accounting purposes. So everything is contextually bound. What confutes the whole issue is that what I may use and judge as a long relationship or marriage may not be the same across cultures or across different types of market settings. And finally, you have to have integrated communications because, as you know, whether it's technology driven or it's driven by more traditional models, communications is the thing that helps all these governance norms, especially the role solidarity, the role integrity, and the mutuality of outcomes. We're going to stop there and move on to part B, which talks a little bit about the different approaches to relationship management.